Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. It is so great to be here for the 24th annual Miami Jewish Film Festival, one of the largest and oldest Jewish cultural arts events. We want to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting organization, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, SAGE Miami, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for all their continued support throughout these years. My name is Carly Orshan, and I'm the director of SAGE Teen Departments in the Miami March Living program. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with David Romberg, the director of the film that we're going to be discussing today. So we want to dive right on in and ask David to share with us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, where you have lived, where you live now, how you got into filmmaking. Basically, give us the 101 of your life. And how that may have shaped your story and the film.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say my upbringing or my childhood was fairly unconventional. For those that have are watching the film, it's part of the story. But I spent my early childhood living on an island in Brazil with no electricity, no running water. Subsisting from things that we were growing outside, fishing, um, living essentially off the grid. And uh, and my father was an artist, and my mother was became an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist. So our family always moved from place to place. We ended up leaving Brazil at one point, and I lived in Israel for over 10 years, where my sisters were born. My family's from Argentina, so that's a whole nother, kind of part of the family who is still there. Most of my family is still in Buenos Aires. There's a large Jewish community in Buenos Aires, and that's one side of the family. And then we left Israel. We came to the United States, where I studied, at Temple University. I studied my undergrad and also graduate school. And eventually my family left the United States and went back to Israel. I stayed here. I stayed in the United States, and a lot of the themes of the film are about, what is home, what is nationality, how do we situate ourselves within different borders, geopolitical borders, and cultures. And I think in my case, it's really been a lifetime kind of search for the meaning of that, of what that really is. What is home? What does it mean to belong to a community? Is it something physical? Is it something that is transient, that is changing constantly? In the case of the Jewish, the I would say the Latin or South American Jewish community, that diaspora is very complex and different than other Jewish diasporas because of all the political turmoil that occurred in Latin America over many decades. So yeah, so it's very complicated, and somehow I think it's incredible that I made it here and I live here now. But my family, apart from my oldest sister, doesn't live in the United States, so we're all very kind of separated in some ways geographically. Um, I hope that was
Yeah, that's great.
good
I
summary.
don't, I don't know if you're familiar with the Miami community, but in particular in North Miami, we have a large Latin community, and I think what you're touching on is really significant for many of the families and many of the community members that they're probably shared a similar migration,
Hmm.
that your family shared, going from, fleeing one area to
Hmm.
another, being in Latin America, many staying, and then some, what your father and, experience needing to leave there again. So I know that that shapes into our identity, and I'm curious, for you with this project, how much of this where did it kind of come from? Was it you seeking for your identity, or was,
Right.
how did you land into filmmaking? How did you land on this project and this journey? Love to know about
Yeah.
that.
Well, I started out as a fine artist really before I got into film. So I studied sculpture and installation art for my undergrad. I was traveling around the world doing installations. I spent a lot of time in Austria, for example, and was working there. And I think film for me was a way to make sense of a lot of things about my life that we're talking about, that I couldn't find other, I would say, languages, visual languages that could address those things. So a lot of a lot of the themes in my film deal with things that we're talking about: identity, how nuanced it is, right? How nuanced identity is, especially for, I would say, um, Latin American Jews who experienced uh, first that leaving Europe, ending up in South America, leaving South America, ending up somewhere. I mean, that's a fairly recent history, and so I think how do you find a language that can address things like trauma, like things like transgenerational trauma and memory? How do you address that, and in a way that is nuanced, in a way that is you know outside of language, even, right? Written language, because often these things are hard to describe and hard to talk about using language. And I think for me, at least, fine arts wasn't the right way, and somehow film was a medium that I connected to, that I thought, this is something that you can make people feel things, you can make impressions on people without having to be didactic, without having to explain things, let's say, explicitly. You can still, I think in some ways, like, film to me, at least in terms of my documentary practice, is not about trying to find the truth, or trying to find an objective truth. It's about a perspective, and it's about a truth, and that truth is subjective, and that truth has to do with all these things that are experiential. How do you describe the the multi-generational complexities of trauma in all these different places and times, and it's like, it's an experience, something that you have to feel sometimes, rather than reading about it doesn't always give you that experience. And so I think, like, film, through sound and through image and through montage and all these tools that we have, it can make us feel things that we don't even understand, right? And I think in some ways, like, transgenerational trauma is very similar. We don't exactly understand why we feel things, remember things that maybe we haven't experienced, but it's very strong, and it's a very strong kind of sensation. So to me, cinema is, again, it's like analogous to some of the things that we might be experiencing, and so it made sense for me to use that as language, I
But I think, you're hitting on something that's significant. There's so many layers that were involved, in this, with the there's so much issues around transgenerational trauma. That's one significant thing. There's this other thing about identity and nationality, and what is so unique to this film for me, and watching it, is that you're so vulnerable in sharing your own journey,
think.
and you're doing so, and you're kind of picking on all of these components, and it's really, some of it is up to the viewer to kind of
Hmm.
pull it together, and I think that that's really impactful, because it allows the viewer to start thinking about their own lives and their own relationships, and I'm curious for you, how this journey was for your own identity development. And I think at one point towards the end, or somewhere in there, I'm forgetting, there was this moment where you talked about your identity and how it's still very fluid trying to find that. How did this journey help you in that process?
So I think ultimately, what you touched upon is really part of the, I would say, the thesis of the film, which is that there isn't really an answer. Just like there isn't, one truth to, like, I'm on this journey to find, you know, uh, the story behind this character, the man or the monkey. But in some ways, it's also an internal search, and I think both don't really have conclusive answers, and they never do, because it's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of, there's a lot of kind of things that are very subjective about, even, I mean, about identity, but also about history. History is something that's also fluid, even though we don't like to admit that history is fluid, but it is. It's fluid because we're constantly changing the way that we look at history, the way that we make sense of it. And history is also a mix of, personal and collective memory, and so that connection, I think, is very complex and nuanced. And so for me, it was like, going through this journey, I was hoping to find something that was conclusive, and ultimately I found out that there isn't an answer, and that, at least now it's just more about kind of admitting or being okay with the idea that you might never feel connected and at home anywhere you go, which I think might be the experience, at least. I mean, for me, that was my experience. And I imagine for a lot of other immigrants, that is the experience of feeling like you've left something behind, feeling like there's pieces of you that exist in multiple places and times. And the idea of being okay with that, I think, is part of the solution, or for me at least was part of the idea of like, well, then I guess I just have to keep making films about this, or I have to keep talking about this, because I don't feel like, even now, I'm really at home. Meaning, I still feel like, ultimately you're at home wherever you meet like-minded people. You're at home wherever you connect with the community, whether it's a physical one or whether it's one that exists in other ways. Um, and so, yeah, so I think the process is, it's, was very, I don't want to say that I didn't find what I was looking for, but in the end, I realized something that I probably knew all along, but that I couldn't see because of where I was. And to be honest, what really started this process was my family leaving the United States when they left the United States. And that's, I think, where I really felt for the first time that I was kind of lost and alone, in the sense of, I could really do anything at that point. I could have gone back to Israel. I could have gone to Argentina, where a lot of my family is. I could have gone back to Brazil. Um, and I could have stayed. And I think that it's like, well, where do you go? You know, what do you go? Because your job might be in one place, your family might be in another. Your ancestral home might be somewhere else, and um, so it's very, it's very, very complicated, I think.
Absolutely. And I think, if I can say so, I think it's very brave that you were able to do this, and to show this journey. And so I'd love to learn a little bit more about the technical aspect behind it
Sure.
all. Um, you know, from from beginning to end, like what was this process for you? And is this your first film that you've curated and directed and
So
made in this way?
it's my
Or
first feature,
okay.
my first feature length documentary.
Okay,
And it
wonderful.
took,
So
yeah, it took a long time, which I think is part of that. Part of that question is really about the process, and the process for this was, it took over 10 years to make this film.
wow.
You can kind of see, in some ways I changed through the film, but also the research I went into it, and all of the pre-production, things that we did before we started shooting, involved me going to the island several times, interviewing people, learning about the culture of the island, learning about the history of the island, learning about my own family's history at the same time, and starting to see all these connections, the layers that exist between, it's like, in some ways I always laughed about this idea of like, what the hell was my family doing? Like, a Jewish family in the middle of the jungle, in this place that's like, far away from everything. Like, why, why were we there? Right. And I think that
Mhm.
question is also part of the journey. Is like, well, what brought us here? What could have led my parents to do something as drastic as to build this house that was in the middle of the rainforest? And I think I understood that later on in the journey. I kind of realized, okay, well, there's a lot of trauma here that spans like hundreds of years, right? Going back to my father's family in Russia, the pogroms, and then my grandmother's family, who was from Hungary and Romania, and who survived the Holocaust and lost most of the family. And so, and then of course Argentina and the dictatorship, and a lot of Jews were targeted also by the dictatorship, students, artists. So once you start going back and you start seeing all of that history, it starts to make more sense about why someone would look for, at least even as an idea, as a fantasy, the idea of a refuge, right? The idea of a safe place where you want, where you can hide or where you can exist peacefully. So, that process took 10 years to get from that idea of like, oh, like why did my family end up here, and what was this crazy story about the man of the monkey? Like why was that such an important part of my life? And then till the end of like finding myself just completely alone, in a country that I assumed was where I was supposed to live, and starting to question some of those things, and in between, there was a lot of trips back and forth to the island. The film didn't have an ending until a few years before it was released, meaning like, for over 5 or 6 years, there was no ending because Ingrid, who was this
Mhm.
surprise kind of character, right, didn't exist as far as we knew. We didn't know that she was still alive. We had looked and we had hired researcher people to look for Ingrid, and nothing came back for years until really something incredible happened, which was that one of my friends living on the island, who was helping us as a kind of producer because she knew everybody. Um, I was in the United States at that time editing the film with no ending, so I was like trying to figure out how to end something, because the story of the Man of the Monkey at that point was just kind of like nothing. We reached a dead end, which is what happens
Mhm.
in the film. I mean, in terms of the narration, right? But we really didn't have an end. So one day I get a message. It was on actually on Facebook. I get a message from my friend in Brazil. That's this strange woman knocks on her door. It's raining out, and she's looking for a place to stay. And my friend has a little like hostel, where she rents rooms, and she invited this woman, to stay at her hostel. And that night they start talking, and the woman reveals to her that she had been to the island before, when she was a kid, because her mother was uh, married, or her mother was with this guy who had a monkey who was living on the island. And all of a sudden, my friend realizes that this is the daughter of Ingrid, this woman that we had been looking
Wow.
for years. We could not find a way to reach her. And here it came to us in a way. So she messaged me on Facebook, says, I think we have an ending. You know, we we contacted Ingrid through her daughter, who was staying with my friend, and we arranged the whole thing. And I flew to Brazil like a week later to finish the film, to do that
Wow.
interview, the interview with Ingrid, which really was like all this wealth of material that we had not found before suddenly came to us. And so I don't know how to explain that, but it was just this kind of, I don't know, magical thing that happened, where um, after 7 years of working on this, suddenly the ending came, right, and it came organically when it was supposed to, and it happened, and and that was that. So there's a lot of stories like that in the film, right? And the island's supposed to be this magical place, which I describe it as, for me at least
Yeah.
as a kid, it was that magical place that where things like that happen. So
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I think that it's very fitting for this film to have something that's so like Bashara, like meant to be this
mhm.
magic, like pulling, that
Yeah,
just kind of framed the whole thing. That's really such a unique story to your process. I'm curious if there are any other, anecdotes that kind of stand out to you about shooting the film,
yeah.
or something that you
Um,
want to share.
well, yeah, there was a few things that. I mean, first of all, it was very difficult to shoot the film. Uh, you know, the weather is completely unpredictable, so all your gear gets wet. It rains for a week straight. You can't shoot. There's no cars. There's no transportation apart from boats. So shooting this film was logistically kind of a nightmare because you don't have control. Like you sometimes feel like you have control. I mean, ultimately, as a filmmaker, you realize you don't have control over most of the things you have control that you think you have control over. But in this case, it was really a very kind of specific shooting production where multiple times we hit storms with the equipment. We were on boats, and the waves were big, big enough that water was coming in the boat, and we had to figure out, how many life preservers there are, how we can tie the equipment to life preservers to make sure that the cameras and all the footage doesn't get destroyed. This was something that, for the
Wow.
crew. I mean, we all kind of joke about it now. At the time, it was scary and kind of like traumatic, but what we experienced as a crew together was pretty incredible. I mean, it was such a tough journey. And I hope that comes through in the film, meaning like that it was really a journey. It wasn't like, I mean, yes, it's edited, of course, it's a film, but, what you see in the film is actually happening. We are going through that journey, and we are discovering these things as you are as an audience member. And so that was one the storm that we hit was one kind of event that was really a little bit traumatic. And then the other thing that I thought was really amazing was encountering Sir Julio, who's one of the um, participants in the documentary. He's the prisoner, or the
Mhm.
you know the the prisoner who plays the trumpet, who was pardoned, and he actually passed away, I think about 2 years ago. But we
Um,
became friends after that interaction, and I ended up making a film about his life. But that shot in the film where he's in the abandoned prison and he's playing the trumpet, to me
yeah.
that was kind of like one of those amazing things that as a filmmaker, you always remember those moments, because it's kind of like visual, where visual poetry just does something. Everything is just connected. The sound, the movement of the camera, the emotional energy between all of us was really kind of heightened, and you can feel it, I think, in the shot. I knew that shot was it. I knew that was like, something really special. We all got goosebumps. We all kind of like were very emotional after that. I think, most of the crew was like crying at that point. We, it was just like such like an emotional human kind of moment for everybody. And after that, we all went out to eat and we ate together. And me and Sir Julie remained friends until he passed away. I actually showed his, like, we did a kind of screening at the prison, at the
Oh,
abandoned prison.
really?
We did a screening with Sir Julio and his friends and some of his family. He has, a few family members still around, so he got to see himself right in the film, and he was very proud of it. And he also, got emotional, and um, so those things I think are incredible, right? I mean, that's why we make documentaries. I mean, just to connect with people like that.
Yeah, I just got goosebumps with you sharing, that he had the chance to see it,
I mean, what
in
people
that
don't
way.
know, and I guess this is another quick anecdote, is that that day, the day that we arrived to interview him, I didn't know this until after the interview, but one of his best friends, who he spent, I don't know, 2 decades with in the prison, had passed away. Like, he found out that day. So there was this whole other kind of psychodrama happening that we were not aware of, and that kind of plays into him going back in time. And when you see him going into the abandoned prison, and so he asked us if he could bring the trumpet, right? And that's like, he already, I think, was thinking about his friend. And so when he
Mhm,
plays, he's really also playing for his friend, I think. And there's something about a funeral there, like this kind of funeral procession
mhm,
that occurs, and at least symbolically. So that's one of those things where, it's unpredictable. I mean, as documentarians, we go and create these relationships with people. We really don't know everything that's happening in their lives, and
mhm.
and everything kind of merges at one point, um and it becomes one thing. The energy becomes one thing. And so I would say, yeah, that was one of my most memorable kind of moments, was that shot.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious why, and you touched on this a little bit, but why this was so important for you to share, in terms of telling it
Yeah.
to the world.
Yeah.
Why is that important to you?
I think part of it is because, um, some of the things we spoke about before, about how nuanced identity is. And I think specifically when we talk about the Jewish diaspora, when we talk about Judaism, and you know Jews are all over the world, right? They ended up all over the world. But there's something about, I think, the experience of of Latin American Jews that I think I wanted to really talk about that identity, right? That element of identity in terms of, it's just not as well represented. Like I feel like there's not as much representation in terms of stories about Latin American Jews and that diaspora that occurred, specifically about how Jews were affected during the dictatorship, not only in Argentina but also in Brazil and in other
Mhm.
countries where you had repressive governments and dictatorships, and it is a unique experience, and I think um, I didn't, I think growing up I didn't see a lot of those kinds of voices. There's like people that assume that if you speak Spanish, well, you can't be Jewish or something. I don't know, or like you're if you speak Spanish, you're South American. But the idea of when I used to tell people, I think even in the United States sometimes when I was growing up, oh, like where is your family from, or where do you think you're from? And I would say, well, my family's from Argentina, and they'd say, wait, there's Jews in Argentina, like, or there's Jews in Brazil, and I think there's a little bit of a I think that was in the 90s, so I think a lot has changed since then, but still I think there's kind of like a lot of there's a misunderstanding about how Jews arrived in South America and what happened after the war. And obviously we hear a lot about Nazis in South America, Mengele and Eichmann and all that, but a part uh, which is something that's more of a collective kind of history. But in terms of individual stories about Jews living in South America, or their experience, I would say, is something that I always felt like I didn't see a lot of that growing up. So I'm really kind of connected to those stories because of my experience. Um, and also having been through, also lived in Israel and having that experience, but also having lived in South America and also having lived in the United States, I think gives me a certain kind of perspective that I think that is a little bit from the outside, a little bit further away, to kind of talk about all these things.
Mhm. Well, I think you do an excellent job with that, because you are giving voice to a demographic that doesn't typically get seen, or kind of really to have their story shared,
Mm.
and you're doing it in such a unique way. So, kol hakavod,
Thank
for
you.
for doing that. And I want to just ask if there's anything else. I'm getting you to go back on this journey that
Mhm.
you went on for 10 years. If there's anything,
Mm.
kind of pressing that you've now been thinking about or ruminating about that you'd like to share with the audience, about the story,
Mhm.
about your journey, about this progress, and project, to I want to open the floor to see if there's anything
Sure.
else that you'd like to share.
Well, the only thing, one thing I did want to say is that in some ways the film is mostly, it's partly dedicated to my father. My father, who gave me this story, who gave me that experience of, I mean, growing up in the way that I did, and in Brazil, I think made me is part of the reason why I'm a filmmaker too. Having that experience and speaking different languages and being taken across the world and all of that. And so part of it is dedicated to him. He passed away in 2019, so he got to see the film when it was finished.
Good.
He didn't see it when he didn't see it kind of premiering, but he got at least to watch it before he passed away. And that has sparked me to make another film now that I'm in post production for another documentary that is about, specifically about my father's experience in Argentina during the dictatorship, and what happened in Tucumán, and what happened in northern Argentina when my father had to leave the country. So in some ways, this is a kind of a prequel to Man of the Monkey, right? It's what happens before Man of the Monkey. How do we get to how did my family get to Brazil? Well, there was this whole other history in Argentina, and so that film kind of tackles that history. And it's a more experimental film in a sense of really trying to, thinking a lot about portraiture and thinking a lot about how to represent things like trauma and memory in a way that is um, that relates to what that process is, and how do you do that visually? Is it through what experimental means do we have to, like what you were saying earlier, to activate the viewer, to get the viewer to connect with something in a way that's not like we're not being told what to think and we're not being told what to watch, but we're getting impressions of something and putting ourselves within that film or within that scene or whatever. And so that's kind of an exciting new thing that is coming up, which is totally related to all these issues of identity, also of specifically for my father, how being a Jewish artist who also was Argentinian and was kind of expelled in some ways from Argentina, how he ends up kind of rejecting nationality, rejecting the idea of being Argentinian, an Argentinian artist, and really saying, I don't belong anywhere, and I'm going to be an artist who's just a citizen of the world rather than an American artist or an Israeli artist or an Argentine artist. So it kind of continues that conversation about identity, but now looking at the creative process. How does that inform the creative process? How does that inform being an artist? You know, when your art becomes more about finding universality or finding ideas that are larger than borders, larger than nationality, right? Um, and I think I'm also interested in that too. So it's also a way of figuring that out through somebody else's story, right? And that's kind of what Man of the Monkey is as well. So
Yeah, I think that's wonderful that you're able to do that, and to be able to go on that journey, in a way to bring in those memories of your father, and to be able to learn from that, because I think that that's also speaking to that demographic that we
mhm,
mentioned, that is not really being heard. I loved in the film when your father said how he was an artist of the world. To
mhm,
me, that was so profound, and I think that kind of going off of that to explore that, is
yeah,
remarkable. Like, I'm excited for you, and I look forward to seeing
yeah.
what comes out of that.
So that film is called The Art of the Aleph. The
The art
Aleph
of
was
that.
a short story by Borges, who was an Argentinian writer. And my father was very inspired by Borges. He actually knew Borges, or he would talk to him in cafes in Argentina. But it's really about that search, that's that kind of universal search for meaning, right? For meaning in terms of who you are in relationship to the world. And so yeah, so that's hopefully will come out in the next year.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited for that, and to have this opportunity to get to know you. My mind is reeling with so many things, as I shared with you in the beginning. At Sage, one of the initiatives that we're looking at is how do we help 3Gs in particular, third generation of
Mhm.
Holocaust survivors, tell their family stories. And right now we're looking at it just through sharing verbally a story, but I think that it comes in so many different medias,
Yeah.
and you're showing that in some capacities, of just the importance of memory, of trauma, of identity. And I hope anyone can share their family stories in those ways. So I think you're a great model for that. And this is I hope everybody enjoys the film and is able to really see the beauty of those things. So I want to thank you,
Well,
David, so much
no,
for your
thank you.
time,
Yeah.
and for The Man of the Monkey. It's a great film, and we look forward to other ones that you are going to come out with.
Yeah.
And a big thank you to all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all of you film lovers, especially to Sage and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support. And thank you all for participating in the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival.